Margaret Chen, a 45-year-old housekeeper, has worked for tech billionaire Richard Blackwood for 3 years at his sprawling Manhattan penthouse. When Richard's estranged father, a decorated Vietnam War veteran, dies unexpectedly, he leaves behind a military-grade safe that no locksmith can crack. The safe contains what Richard believes are his inheritance documents and family secrets he desperately needs to settle his father's estate. As financial pressures mount and family lawyers demand answers, Richard grows increasingly frustrated with failed attempts to open it. Margaret, who has been quietly observing and whose own father served in the same war unit, recognizes subtle military references around the house. When she finally reveals she knows the code, her father's old radio call sign that she overheard Richard's father muttering during his final visits, it unlocks not just the safe, but a profound connection between two people from vastly different worlds, forever changing both their lives. So still Wafu, the November rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor, each drop exploding like tiny grenades against the bulletproof glass. Margaret Chen pressed her cloth against the marble countertop with practiced precision, her movements steady, despite the storm raging outside. She had been cleaning Richard Blackwood's penthouse for 3 years now, long enough to know that Tuesday mornings meant silence, the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that settled over the 12,000-square-foot space like morning fog over Central Park. Richard sat hunched over his mahogany desk in the corner office, his usually impeccable posture crumbling under the weight of papers scattered before him. At 38, he commanded boardrooms with the confidence of a man who had built his tech empire from nothing, but today his shoulders sagged like those of someone carrying invisible chains. The blue glow from his 3 monitors cast harsh shadows across his angular face, highlighting the dark circles that had become permanent fixtures beneath his green eyes since his father's funeral 2 weeks ago. Margaret had attended that funeral, standing respectfully in the back row of St. Patrick's Cathedral. She remembered how Richard had stared at the closed casket with a mixture of grief and something else, regret perhaps, or unfinished business. Colonel James Blackwood had been a decorated Vietnam veteran, a man whose military bearing never left him even in civilian clothes. Margaret had seen him only a handful of times during his visits to the penthouse, always carrying himself with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to command, his steel-grey eyes holding secrets that seemed to weigh heavier with each passing year. Mrs. Chen. Richard's voice cut through the morning stillness, rougher than usual from lack of sleep and too much coffee. Could you give me a moment in the study? She nodded without question, folding her cleaning cloth with the same methodical care she applied to everything. Margaret understood the language of grief, how it demanded space to breathe, how it made even the simplest requests feel monumental. Her own father had died when she was 22, taking with him stories of his service in Vietnam that she would never fully understand. The study was Richard's sanctuary, lined with first-edition books and awards from his various technological innovations. But today it felt more like a mausoleum. In the center of the room sat the object that had been consuming Richard's thoughts for the past 14 days, a military-grade safe, roughly 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, its olive-green surface bearing the scars of decades and the weight of whatever secrets lay locked within. Richard ran his fingers through his dark hair, a gesture Margaret had noticed he made when facing particularly challenging problems. "The locksmith was here again yesterday," he said, not really speaking to her, but needing to voice his frustration to someone who would listen without judgment. "Third one this month. They all say the same thing. It's not just about the combination. There's some kind of secondary security system, something they've never encountered in civilian safes." Margaret approached the safe with quiet curiosity, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the Persian rug. The metal was cold to the touch, and she could see the intricate dial system that had confounded every expert Richard had consulted. But it was the small inscription near the base that caught her attention, numbers and letters that looked familiar, though she couldn't immediately place why. "My father never told me the combination," Richard continued, his voice taking on the bitter edge that had become increasingly common since the funeral. 3 years of barely speaking, and now this. His lawyer says there might be important documents inside, insurance policies, investment records, maybe even information about my mother's family that he never shared. The estate can't be properly settled without whatever's in there. The financial pressure was real, Margaret knew. Despite Richard's success, the tech industry was notoriously volatile, and his father's medical bills from the cancer treatment had been substantial. The old man had been proud, refusing Richard's offers of help until it was too late, leaving behind a tangle of debts and unresolved questions that the safe might answer. Margaret studied Richard's face as he stared at the impenetrable metal box. She had watched him navigate hostile takeovers and impossible deadlines with unwavering determination, but this was different. This wasn't about business strategy or market analysis. This was about a relationship that had remained locked away as securely as whatever lay inside that safe. "He used to mutter things," Richard said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "During his last few visits, when the medication made him confused, numbers mostly, sometimes names I didn't recognize. Military stuff, I think, but I never paid close enough attention." The regret in his voice was palpable, another weight added to an already overwhelming burden. Outside, the storm was intensifying, and Margaret could hear the distant wail of sirens navigating the flooded streets, 42 floors below. She had seen many storms from these windows, watched the city transform under different weather patterns, but today felt different, as if the external chaos was merely reflecting the turmoil within these walls. As she prepared to leave Richard to his solitary struggle with the safe, something stirred in her memory, a half-remembered conversation with her own father about radio codes and military protocols. The numbers on the safe's inscription suddenly seemed less random, more purposeful, but she kept her thoughts to herself, understanding that some revelations required their own timing, their own perfect storm of readiness and revelation. The following morning brought no relief from the relentless November weather. Margaret arrived at the penthouse at precisely 7:30, as she had every weekday for the past 3 years, her umbrella dripping steadily in the marble foyer. The familiar ritual of hanging her coat and gathering her supplies felt different now, weighted with an awareness she couldn't quite shake. The numbers from the safe's inscription had haunted her dreams, dancing just beyond the reach of complete recognition. Richard was already awake, which wasn't unusual, but his appearance suggested he hadn't slept at all. His expensive button-down shirt was wrinkled, sleeves rolled up haphazardly, and his normally pristine workspace looked like a tornado had swept through it. Papers were scattered across every surface, printouts of military websites, genealogy records, photocopies of his father's discharge papers that he'd somehow managed to obtain from the Veterans Administration. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," Margaret said softly, noting the empty coffee cups that dotted the room like ceramic monuments to his sleepless night. "Morning, Mrs. Chen." His voice was hoarse, and when he looked up, she could see the desperation that had taken root behind his bloodshot eyes. "I've been researching all night. Did you know my father's unit, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, used specific radio call signs during their operations in Vietnam? Each soldier had a unique identifier, a series of numbers and letters that became as much a part of their identity as their own names." Margaret began collecting the empty cups, her movements careful and deliberate. She had learned long ago that the wealthy often needed to voice their thoughts to someone who would listen, without offering unwanted advice or judgment. But as Richard spoke about radio call signs, something cold settled in her stomach, a recognition that felt both thrilling and terrifying. "I found this." Richard held up a faded photograph, his hands trembling slightly from too much caffeine and too little sleep. It showed a group of young soldiers in jungle fatigues, their faces bearing the particular gravity that only combat could etch into human features. "That's my father, second from the left. He was barely 22 when this was taken." Margaret accepted the photograph, studying the faces of men who had been younger than her own son when they'd been thrust into a war that would define the rest of their lives. Colonel James Blackwood stood with the rigid posture she remembered, but his face held none of the weathered hardness she'd associated with him. Instead, she saw vulnerability, fear masked by training and duty. "These men," she said carefully, "they were all from the same unit. Echo Company, 173rd Airborne Brigade, 1967 to 1969. Richard recited the information like a prayer, as if the specificity might somehow unlock the secrets his father had taken to the grave. "I've been trying to track down any surviving members, but most of them are," he gestured helplessly, "gone. Either dead or impossible to find after all these years." Margaret's heart began to pound against her ribs with increasing intensity. Her father, Samuel Chen, had served as a radio operator during Vietnam, attached to various units, including, she was almost certain, the 173rd Airborne Brigade. She had boxes of his old letters and military documents stored in her small Queen's apartment, papers she'd been too emotional to examine thoroughly after his death 15 years ago. Radio operators. she said, her voice carefully neutral. They would have worked closely with units like your father's. Richard nodded eagerly, sensing her interest. Exactly. They were the lifeline between the field units and command. Each operator had specific codes, specific call signs that were used to identify friendly forces and coordinate operations. Without them, these men would have been completely cut off from support. The storm outside seemed to be intensifying, and Margaret could feel the building sway almost imperceptibly in the high winds. She had cleaned through many storms in this penthouse, but today the weather felt ominous, as if nature itself was responding to the weight of buried secrets struggling to surface. "Mr. Blackwood," she said slowly, setting down the photograph with hands that had begun to tremble. "What was your father's call sign?" "That's just it, I don't know. I've been searching through everything I can find, but military records from that era are incomplete. So many were destroyed in a fire at the National Personnel Records Center in 1973. Whatever documentation might have survived is buried in bureaucracy that could take months to navigate." His frustration was palpable, and Margaret could see how the uncertainty was eating away at him. She walked to the window, ostensibly to clean the glass, but really to give herself time to think. Her reflection stared back at her, superimposed over the storm-darkened city below. At 55, she had learned to navigate the delicate balance of her position, close enough to the family's private moments to understand their struggles, distant enough to maintain professional boundaries. But this felt different. This felt personal in a way that transcended employment. "Sometimes," she said carefully, still facing the window, "the families of veterans keep more records than the government. Letters, photographs, personal items that might contain information not found in official documents." Richard's chair creaked as he leaned forward. "Are you saying you think there might be other sources, other ways to find out what I need to know?" Margaret turned slowly, meeting his gaze with steady composure, despite the chaos of recognition building in her chest. "I'm saying that sometimes the answers we're looking for are closer than we think. Sometimes they're hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves." The safe sat in the corner like a silent sentinel, its olive green surface gleaming dully in the grey morning light. Margaret found herself staring at it, at the numbers and letters inscribed near its base, and felt the final pieces of a 30-year-old puzzle beginning to click into place. But revealing what she suspected would change everything, not just for Richard, but for her own carefully constructed world of professional distance and emotional safety. The storm showed no signs of abating, and neither did the weight of secrets that filled the room like humidity before lightning strikes. Margaret spent her lunch break in the small employee rest area, staring at her untouched sandwich, while her mind raced through fragments of half-remembered conversations. Her father's voice echoed across the decades. "Whiskey 7-4, this is Dragon 6, over." Words she'd heard him mutter during nightmares that had plagued him until his death. She had been too young then to understand the significance, too focused on her own struggles as a recent immigrant, trying to build a life in America. When she returned to the penthouse, Richard was on the phone with what sounded like another military records specialist, his voice strained with barely contained frustration. She could hear him explaining the situation for what must have been the dozenth time this week, describing the safe, his father's service record, the urgent need to access whatever documents lay locked inside. 6 to 8 weeks, he said, after hanging up, his voice hollow with defeat. That's the fastest they can process a records request, and even then there's no guarantee they'll find anything useful. The lawyer called this morning. Creditors are starting to circle, and without those insurance documents or investment records, I might lose the family property upstate. Margaret had heard about the Blackwood family estate, 200 acres in the Catskills that had been in the family for 3 generations. Richard rarely spoke about it, but she knew it held sentimental value far beyond its monetary worth. It was where he'd spent summers as a child, before his relationship with his father became strained by expectation and disappointment. "Perhaps," she said carefully, continuing to dust the bookshelf near the safe, "you could tell me more about your father's final visits. Sometimes people say things when their guard is down, things they might not remember saying." Richard rubbed his temples, a gesture that had become increasingly frequent. The cancer medication made him confused near the end. He'd drift in and out of lucidity, sometimes thinking he was back in Vietnam. He'd talk about his squad, about radio calls they'd received, about friends who didn't make it home. His voice caught slightly. "I wish I'd listened more carefully. I was so focused on work, on maintaining the distance we'd built up over the years." Margaret set down her dustcloth, and moved closer to where Richard sat slumped in his leather chair. In 3 years of working for him, she had never seen him look so defeated, so utterly at a loss for how to proceed. The man who had revolutionized digital security protocols was being undone by an analog lock that refused to yield its secrets. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice gentler than usual, "sometimes the people we think we've lost continue to speak to us, but we have to be willing to listen with more than just our ears." He looked up at her with curiosity, perhaps hearing something different in her tone. "What do you mean?" Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she approached the precipice of revelation. Once she spoke the words forming in her mind, there would be no taking them back, no returning to the comfortable anonymity of her position. But watching Richard's desperation, seeing how the weight of unresolved relationship with his father was crushing him, she knew she couldn't remain silent. "Your father used to whisper things during his visits," she said slowly. "I thought he was just confused, but now hearing you talk about radio call signs and military codes, I think he was remembering something specific, something important." Richard leaned forward, sudden hope flickering in his exhausted eyes. "What kind of things? Do you remember any specifics?" Margaret walked to the safe, her fingers tracing the inscription that had been haunting her thoughts. "Dragon 6, she said quietly. "He used to repeat those words along with a series of numbers. I thought it was just rambling, but my father served as a radio operator in Vietnam, attached to various units, including the 173rd Airborne Brigade." The silence that followed felt electric, charged with possibility and revelation. Richard stood slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile connection was forming between past and present. "Dragon 6, he repeated. "That sounds like a call sign." "It was," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father mentioned it in letters he wrote to my mother during the war. Dragon 6 was the call sign for the radio operator assigned to Echo Company, 173rd Airborne Brigade, during their operations in the Mekong Delta in 1968. Richard's face went pale. "Your father, he knew my father." Margaret nodded, feeling tears she hadn't expected beginning to well in her eyes. "They served together for 18 months. My father used to talk about a young sergeant named Jimmy Blackwood, said he was one of the bravest men he'd ever known, but also one of the most haunted. Said the war changed him in ways that would never fully heal." The implications of this revelation hung between them like a bridge spanning 30 years of silence. Margaret had known on some level, from the moment she'd first seen Colonel Blackwood during his visits to the penthouse, something about his bearing, his way of moving through space, had reminded her of her own father's military precision. But she had pushed the recognition aside, unwilling to complicate her professional relationship with personal history. "The night before your father died," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "he called here. I answered the phone because you were in Seattle for that conference. He was confused, kept asking for Dragon 6, kept repeating a series of numbers and letters. I thought he was asking for my father, but my father died 15 years ago." Richard moved to stand beside her at the safe, both of them staring at the mechanical puzzle that had consumed his thoughts for weeks. "What numbers?" he asked. "What letters did he repeat?" Margaret closed her eyes, reaching back through the years to access memories she had tried to forget. Her father's voice mixing with Colonel Blackwood's in her mind, two old soldiers speaking across time and death about secrets that had defined their lives. "Whiskey 74, she said finally. "He kept saying, 'Whiskey 74, Dragon 6 actual,' over and over like he was trying to make radio contact with someone who couldn't answer." Richard's breathing became shallow, his engineer's mind immediately recognizing the pattern. "That's it," he whispered. "That's his call sign. Whiskey 74. Margaret's hands trembled as she approached the safe's dial, the weight of 30 years of buried connections pressing down on her shoulders. Richard stood beside her, his breath shallow with anticipation, watching as she knelt before the olive-green metal that had guarded its secrets for so long. The storm outside had finally begun to subside, leaving behind the kind of crystalline silence that follows emotional hurricanes. "Whiskey 74, she whispered, her fingers finding the cold metal of the dial. The first turn felt monumental, as if she were unlocking not just a safe but the hidden connections between two families whose lives had been intertwined by war and circumstance long before either of them understood the implications. The dial moved smoothly, W for whiskey, corresponding to 23 on the numerical sequence her father had taught her during childhood games that she now realized had been much more than simple entertainment. 7, 4. Each number clicked into place with mechanical precision, but the safe remained sealed. "There's more," Richard said, his voice tight with nervous energy. Military safes from that era often required multiple authentication sequences. "What else did he say? What other codes did your father mention?" Margaret closed her eyes, allowing herself to drift back to those final, confused conversations with Colonel Blackwood. His voice had carried the particular cadence of someone speaking across vast distances, not just physical, but temporal and emotional. In his medication-induced haze, he had been reaching back through decades to touch base with the only person who might understand the weight he'd carried since Vietnam. "Dragon 6, actual," she murmured, her fingers moving to input the corresponding numerical sequence. "That was my father's identification when he was field promoted to senior radio operator, DRAGON, 418-17-15-14. Then 6. The second sequence engaged with a deeper mechanical sound, but still the safe remained locked. Margaret felt frustration building in her chest, not just her own, but Richard's radiating anxiety and the ghostly disappointment of 2 dead soldiers whose final communication had been entrusted to her memory. "Think," Richard said, beginning to pace behind her with the restless energy of someone accustomed to solving complex problems through persistence and logic. "What else? There has to be another layer, another code." Military security protocols from that era were designed to be virtually unbreachable. Margaret stood slowly, her knees protesting after kneeling on the Persian rug. She walked to the window where the afternoon sun was finally breaking through the storm clouds, casting long shadows across the polished floor. In the distance, she could see Central Park beginning to emerge from the grey shroud of weather, joggers and dog walkers tentatively reclaiming the paths. "He talked about coming home," she said suddenly, the memory surfacing with startling clarity. During that last phone call after he gave the call signs, he started talking about coming home, but not from the hospital, from Vietnam. He said something about final extraction coordinates and mentioned a date. November 15th, 1968. Richard stopped pacing, his mind immediately processing the significance. That would be a date-based sequence. Military operations often used extraction dates as secondary authentication. November 15th, 68, 11:15 to 68. Margaret returned to the safe, her movements now guided by an intuition that felt larger than her own knowledge. As she input the date sequence, she found herself thinking about the strange mathematics of connection, how 2 families could orbit each other for decades without realizing their gravitational pull, how the children of warriors could find themselves drawn together by invisible threads woven from shared trauma and unspoken understanding. The third sequence engaged with a different sound entirely, not just mechanical clicking, but the deep, satisfying thunk of heavy tumblers falling into place. For a moment, neither of them moved, both afraid that any sudden motion might break the spell of progress. "Try the handle," Richard whispered. Margaret grasped the heavy steel handle and turned. For 30 years, this safe had guarded its contents against every attempt at intrusion, but now it yielded as easily as a door opening to welcome an expected guest. The seal broke with a soft hiss, and the thick door swung open on well-oiled hinges. Inside, the safe was more spacious than its external dimensions had suggested, containing neat stacks of documents, photograph albums, and several small wooden boxes that spoke of careful preservation. But it was the letter lying on top of everything else that drew their immediate attention, an envelope addressed in Colonel Blackwood's distinctive handwriting. "For Richard, when the dragon brings you home." Richard's hands shook as he opened the envelope, extracting several pages of his father's careful script. Margaret stepped back respectfully, understanding that some moments required privacy, but Richard gestured for her to stay. "He wrote this for both of us," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he scanned the opening lines. "Listen to this. If you're reading this, it means Margaret Chen found the courage to remember what her father taught her, and you found the wisdom to listen. Samuel Chen saved my life more times than I can count during our 18 months in hell, and his daughter has been watching over you without either of you knowing why." Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks as Richard continued reading his father's final attempt at connection and reconciliation. The letter detailed not just the military bonds between the 2 men, but Colonel Blackwood's decades of guilt over his inability to process his war experiences, his regret over the emotional distance he'd maintained with his son, and his profound gratitude for the way Margaret had cared for Richard with the same protective instinct her father had shown for his fellow soldiers. The safe contained everything Richard had hoped for: insurance policies, investment records, deeds to property. But more importantly, it held the explanation for connections that had shaped both their lives without their conscious awareness. Two families, bound by war and loss, had found their way back to each other through the simple act of remembering that some codes are written not in numbers and letters, but in the deeper language of human understanding and shared purpose. As the Manhattan afternoon light filled the penthouse with golden warmth, Margaret and Richard sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the open treasures of the past and the possibility of a future built on foundation stronger than employer and employee, a friendship forged in the crucible of inherited memory and mutual recognition.